Hey everybody, this is the fourth here, and welcome to part 0 of my mixing tutorial series, which is all about sound selection. I've called this section of the tutorial part 0 because it's not strictly mixing. Sound selection isn't exactly mixing, but it is all related, and that's why I've included it in this tutorial series. This section is a little bit tricky for me, because I want to include it early on in this tutorial. I think it's important for you to know the role that sound selection plays in the mixing process sooner than later. However, sound selection relates to several different elements of the mixing process, and if you're a beginner and watching this tutorial in order, then you probably don't know very much about these different elements of mixing, or the terms used to talk about them. So because of this, you might not fully understand some of what I say in this video. Some of the terms I use and things I talk about might go over your head right now, which is okay. Hopefully you have watched the sound explained videos as part of the introduction to this tutorial, because those should help you understand certain things a little more. If you haven't watched them, then I definitely recommend you go back and watch them before watching the rest of this video. So watching those sound explained videos should help, but you still may not understand everything completely, and that's perfectly fine. As long as you understand the basic concepts of what I'm saying, as long as you understand that good sound selection and sound design are important in achieving a good mix, then you know enough about this section for now. At the end of this series, I will tell you to go back to this section, and when you do, you should understand everything in much more depth. The role that sound selection and sound design play in the mixing process will be a lot clearer to you at that point, and the examples I talk about in this video will also make more sense. So, sound selection isn't something that comes up on many mixing tutorials, but it is very important to the final quality of your song. Using the right sounds can make the mixing process a whole lot easier, and it's hard to get a good mix if you're using low quality or muddy sounds. In this video, I will be giving you some tips to consider while selecting or creating the sounds that you plan to use in your song. To start things off, you want to make sure that you're using clean, high-quality sounds. And when I say high quality, I'm not strictly talking about the technical quality of the sound. That's definitely a part of it, but what I'm talking about here goes beyond that. You want to make sure your sounds are high quality from a subjective standpoint as well. Do they sound good to you? If a professional studio records a band and ends up with static, muddiness, DC offset, distortion, or anything else that is affecting the quality of the recording in a negative way, they are probably going to do another recording to get better quality audio to mix with. And the same principle applies to electronic music. You should be using clean, high-quality sounds to create your tracks with, and this will allow you to get a much better result with less unnecessary effort while mixing. Now, there are cases where you may specifically want to use lower quality sounds, like if you're intending a lo-fi sound or if you want a distorted vocal. But unless it's intended, you should definitely stick to higher quality sounds. If you want beautiful orchestral strings in your track, it all starts with a good quality sound source. You also want to make sure that you're using the right sounds. So if you want a punchy snare in your mix, you need to use a punchy snare sound to start with. If your snare sample doesn't have a good presence in certain frequency ranges, no amount of EQ or compression will get you the sound you want. And this goes for all of your other sounds as well. They should pretty much sound how you want them to before the mixing process. Now, you can, of course, do some amount of modification while mixing, but it's best to start with a sound that is very close to the sound you want in the first place. And it is true that there are layering and processing techniques that you can use to craft sounds to be exactly how you want them, starting with sounds that may sound completely different from your desired sound. And many producers do this. But in my opinion, this is sound design, not mixing. If you are doing this, you still should get your sound sounding pretty much how you want before you start mixing, just to help keep the mixing process a bit more straightforward. You also want to use sounds that go well together. So when you're selecting the sounds you're going to use for a song, you want to make sure they all fit together well. And there are a couple of things to consider while selecting your sounds to make sure they fit. The first is whether they go together in more of an artistic sense. Now, this isn't strictly mixing, but it is related. If you have a hi-hat sound that is very out of place with the rest of your drums, your song won't sound quite right even with a good mix. So just make sure you take your time picking out or making instruments that sound as if they go together well or contrast each other in a pleasing way. And then the second thing you want to pay attention to is how your sounds will go together in the mix. If you're using too many sounds that occupy the same frequency range, you'll have a harder time getting a clean mix. You want each sound to have its own space in the mix. And you can do this in a busy mix using the techniques explained in the later parts of this tutorial. But sound selection plays a big part as well. There are many factors that affect whether your sounds go together well in the mix. So as you watch through the later parts of this tutorial, think about how sound selection plays into each one. At the end of this tutorial, I will also recommend you go back to this video and watch it again, just so that you can get a better idea of how sound selection can play into each part of the tutorial. So next up, you want to use sounds that cover the whole frequency spectrum. You don't need a ton of sounds to have a full sounding mix, as long as the sounds you do have cover the whole frequency spectrum. And when I say this, I don't mean that you need to have every small frequency band represented to create something like a straight line on your audio spectrum, or what some might call a brick wall mix, because a spacious open mix can be great. What I do mean is that you want a general coverage of the lows, the mids, and the highs. So the most basic drum kit will have a kick to cover the low end, a snare or a clap to cover the mids, and some hi-hats and cymbals to cover the highs. For instruments and synthesized sounds, you might have separate sounds in each range, or you may have one layer that covers everything. On the other hand, you may not need to cover a certain range with your synths if the drums cover it well enough. And a great example of this would be if you have 808 kicks, you might not need a separate bass line. And a lot of the time, your hi-hats will cover the high end enough that you don't need too much high-end information in your synths. This all depends on the genre and the style of music, but I just wanted to give you a couple examples. Last but not least, you want to make sure your sound design is good. And this is pretty much the same idea as the first 2 points, but instead of choosing sounds, you're making them. So if you want a crisp lead, it's better to design your lead to be crisp in the first place. If you design your lead wrong, you may not be able to get it as crisp as you want with EQ or other mixing techniques. And if you're using distortion in your sound design, it might be good to do some EQ before the distortion to shape the sound and get it roughly where you want it to be before you even mix. This produces a bit of a different sound than doing EQ after the distortion, and I really like that sound. It also helps you get a much cleaner distortion sound. And this doesn't mean you won't EQ as normal afterwards while mixing, but it will be quite a bit easier if you've already shaped the sound to be roughly what you want. Now, I don't want you to think that if you're not really great with sound design, that you have to go and learn sound design in depth before you can continue this mixing series. That's not the case at all. Because a lot of the things I will show you in this tutorial series, and a lot of the techniques and all of that will translate directly into helping you make your sound design better. And I actually recommend people to focus on mixing before they really go into depth about learning sound design, because so many of the concepts from mixing directly translate into designing good, powerful sounds. So definitely continue watching this tutorial series, do the exercises to get some good practice and help you train your ear, and chances are your sound design will improve quite a bit by the end of this tutorial, as well as your mixes. Now, if you're watching this video at some point in the future, I'm hoping to have a full section similar to this mixing series, all about sound design. So you can go check that out and maybe bookmark it if you want to learn a lot more about sound design. But for now, I would definitely recommend to focus on mixing first and just get a good grasp of the mixing process.